Oh man, welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. Um, Look, I'm just gonna keep it real, man. This is the last video of this series. I know there's the sayings of Agur in chapter 30, and there's the sayings of King Lemuel in chapter 31. I know and I'm not saying they're not beneficial or even profound or good to look at because they are, but maybe later, maybe another time in the future. But I'm getting kind of yeah, not. I was gonna say I'm getting kind of burnt out, but I don't mean that in a bad way because I shouldn't be getting burnt out by the freaking Bible. But it's just I need to take just a lot of talking. Anyways, today's verse comes from chapter 29, verse 27, which says, "An unjust man is an abomination to the righteous, but one whose way is straight is an abomination to the wicked." Man, all right. Well, let me just set this stage here because as you guys know, I mean, this verse is the final verse of the final chapter before the the book shifts into its closing appendices in the last couple chapters. But I think that placement is just not accidental. I think it's not. I think Solomon ends his collection of practical wisdom observations with a verse that functions almost as a summary diagnosis of the fundamental division running through human society. Not a division of wealth or status or intelligence or opportunity, but a division of moral orientation, of which direction the heart is ultimately pointed. I think the verse is structured as a perfect symmetry, and that symmetry is the point. That the righteous and the wicked are not merely different from each other, but they are each to the other an abomination. The word is mutual and the structure is exact. This is not a verse about one group being superior and looking down on an inferior group, but it is a verse about two fundamentally different orientations toward reality that are, I think, at the deepest level, incompatible with each other. And the feeling each produces in the other is not mild discomfort or casual preference, but it is abomination. And I just think that word deserves more than a quick read. Because in a book that has been building a sustained case for wisdom, righteousness, and the fear of the Lord, the final verse before the closing sections, I think, names the starkest possible version of what is ultimately at stake here and the choices this book has been calling us to make. So, let's just break down the verse. It says, "An unjust man is an abomination to the righteous." Now, the word abomination, for context, toiva, is one of the strongest words in the Hebrew moral vocabulary. It describes something that produces deep revulsion, something fundamentally at odds with what is right and good to the point of being genuinely offensive to encounter. It is a word used throughout the Old Testament for things that are not merely wrong, but that violate the moral order at the most basic level. It is also significantly the word most frequently used throughout Proverbs and the broader Old Testament for things that God himself finds abominable, right? Proverbs 6:16 lists 7 things the Lord hates, calling them abominations. Proverbs 11:1 says a false balance is an abomination to the Lord. Proverbs 12:22 says that lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. And so the word carries the weight of genuine moral revulsion rooted in the character of God himself. So when Proverbs 29:27 says the unjust man is an abomination to the righteous, I think it is saying that the righteous person's response to injustice reflects something of God's own response to it. The unjust man is someone whose life is characterized by moral wrongness, the violation of what is right in relation to God and others. And, this encompasses the full range of wickedness that we have traced throughout the entire series, right? The sower of injustice from Proverbs 22:8, the schemer of Proverbs 12:2, the person who validates wickedness from Proverbs 24:24, the pit digger in Proverbs 26:7, right? All of these are expressions of the unjust man whose very existence in the moral landscape is described here as abominable to the person of genuine righteousness. And I just think that this raises such an important clarification because the language of abomination, I think, can be dangerously misapplied in human relationships, right? Like the revulsion of the righteous person feels toward the unjust man is not a license for contempt, cruelty, or the kind of self-righteous dismissal of human beings that treats them as less than bearers of the image of God. But Proverbs 25:21-22 told us to feed our enemies when they are hungry. Matthew 5:44 commands love for those who persecute us. right? The abomination described in Proverbs 29:27 is not a hatred of persons, but it is a moral revulsion toward what injustice is and what it does, toward the pattern of conduct and its effects on the people it harms, rather than a wholesale rejection of the human being caught in it. And I just think that distinction is crucial because it is the same distinction God himself maintains. Romans 5:8 states that God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Right? The God who finds wickedness abominable is simultaneously the God who loves the wicked enough to send his son to die for them. And those two realities, I think, do not contradict each other, but they describe the full complexity of a God whose holiness cannot coexist with evil and whose love cannot abandon the person made in his image who is caught in it. And so the righteous person who finds the unjust man abominable is called to maintain that same complex posture, genuine moral revulsion toward injustice and genuine love for the person. And then the verse goes on to say, but the one whose way is straight is an abomination to the wicked. I think this is pretty striking, because not only is the unjust man an abomination to the righteous, but the person of straight, upright living is an abomination to the wicked. So the feeling is mutual, right? The revulsion runs in both directions. And I think understanding why the wicked find the righteous abominable is equally as important as understanding why the righteous find the wicked abominable. And one whose way is straight, just for context, describes the person whose life path has the moral alignment and integrity that we established in Proverbs 2:21, right? The upright and those with integrity who inhabit the land. And so their straightness is not self-righteous or performative virtue, but it is the genuine alignment of their life with what is right, the fruit of the fear of the Lord, the humility, the integrity, and just the pursuit of righteousness and love that we have traced across the entire book. The wicked person finds this straightness abominable, and the reason is worth unpacking carefully because I think it's just more specific than simple envy or social irritation. Like the righteous person's straight life is an abomination to the wicked because it functions as a kind of living indictment of the wicked person's own choices, right? The presence of genuine righteousness in the vicinity of wickedness makes the wickedness visible in a way that is not visible when surrounded only by other wickedness. But the straight line drawn next to the crooked one reveals the crookedness in a way that just no amount of abstract moral alignment or argument, can replicate. And even, in the New Testament, in John 3:19-20, proves the theological diagnosis of this exact dynamic. Jesus says, this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. And for everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his work should be exposed. Right? And so the hatred of the light is the wicked person's abomination toward the righteous in Proverbs 29:27. And the exposure is what the righteous person's straight life produces in the vicinity of wickedness simply by being what it is. The wicked do not find the righteous abominable because the righteous have done anything wrong to them, but they find them abominable because their very existence exposes what darkness looks like when genuine light is present. And I just think this pattern appears repeatedly in the biblical narrative, if you think about it, right? Joseph's righteousness produced hatred in his brothers. Daniel's integrity provoked the officials who sought his destruction. The early church's faithfulness generated persecution from those whose systems it implicitly challenged. So, in every case we see here, the righteous were not targeted because of something they did wrong, but because of something that they were doing right. Their straightness was, to the wicked in their vicinity, basically an abomination. And Proverbs 29:10 sits just 17 verses before our passage, and I think it makes a directly related observation. It says, bloodthirsty men hate one who is blameless and seek the life of the upright. And so the hatred is not incidental, but it is the natural response of the person whose wickedness is exposed by the presence of genuine blamelessness. The seeking of the life of the upright is the extreme expression of the wicked person's abomination toward the straight way. And I just think that the verse as a whole, with its perfect symmetry, is therefore making a statement about the irreducible nature of the moral division in human society. There is no neutral middle ground where the righteous and the wicked are simply indifferent to each other. But the moral orientations are just genuinely incompatible enough that each one produces in the other a response that goes all the way to the level of abomination. not always expressed violently, not always consciously recognized, but present at the level of fundamental moral sensibility in a way that just cannot be fully dissolved by social proximity or mutual tolerance. So let's just get into some practical applications here, because as I always say in my videos, I truly believe that turning knowledge into action is one of the most important things that we can do, that we can foster in our Christian life. And so the first thing is to just let our moral revulsion toward injustice be genuinely informative rather than merely emotional. And what I mean by this is that, the righteous person's abomination towards the unjust man is not presented in this verse as a character flaw to be managed or as a bias to be corrected, but it is presented as a morally appropriate response to what injustice actually is. And I just think practically this means taking seriously the instinctive moral revulsion we feel toward genuine injustice rather than suppressing it in the name of tolerance or social peace. Because when we witness exploitation, deception, or the harm of vulnerable people and feel something in us that recoils from it, that response is not bigotry, but it is the appropriate human response to something that God himself finds abominable. The question is not whether to feel it, but what to do with it. And the righteous response of abomination is not passive disgust, but it is the active pursuit of justice, the rebuke of wickedness at appropriate cost, and the protection of those being harmed, all of which Proverbs has addressed at length throughout the series we've been building. Second thing is to expect and even prepare for the abomination that genuine righteousness provokes. Because, I just think one of the most practically important applications of the second half of this verse is the expectation that it sets for anyone pursuing genuine righteousness in a context where wickedness is present, right? If the straight way is an abomination to the wicked, then the person walking the straight way should not be surprised when they encounter hostility, resistance, or the kind of disproportionate opposition that seems too intense for what was actually done. Right, that hostility is often not primarily about anything the righteous person has done to the wicked person, but it is about what the righteous person's very existence exposes. Jesus warned his disciples about exactly this in John 15:18 and 19, where he says, "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you." And so the hatred we see is the abomination of Proverbs 29:27 in its most direct expression. And I just think expecting it and refusing to be destabilized by it is just a practical application of knowing why it is coming. And the third thing is to just maintain the complexity of genuine righteousness that feels abomination toward injustice without becoming abominable itself. I believe the deepest and most demanding application of this verse is the call to hold together two things that are genuinely difficult to maintain concurrently. Right? Genuine moral revulsion towards injustice, which, don't get me wrong, is appropriate and reflects the character of God, and genuine love for the unjust person, which is equally appropriate and equally reflects the character of God. But the person who feels abomination towards injustice without love for the unjust person has arrived at contempt rather than righteousness. And the person who claims to love the unjust person without feeling any moral revulsion toward their injustice has arrived at a tolerance that is not actually righteous. And so the complexity of holding both is not a theological puzzle to be resolved, but it is just the daily practice of a person whose moral formation has gone deep enough to feel what God feels about evil and simultaneously love what God loves about the person that caught in it. So, let me just say this, because that was kind of a lot. Look, Proverbs 29:27 closes the main body of Solomon's just immaculate wisdom collection with a verse that refuses to let us pretend the division between righteousness and wickedness is a minor or negotiable difference. But it is a fundamental and mutual difference, and it goes all the way to the level of abomination in both directions. And so this is not a comfortable place to end. I acknowledge that, but it's an honest one. You know, the book of Proverbs has just been vast, and it's been calling us towards the straight way, toward wisdom rooted in the fear of the Lord, toward the kind of character that reflects God's own character into the world. And this final verse names what the character will encounter in a world where the unjust man is still walking his crooked path, right? I mean, look, the straight way will be an abomination to those who love the crooked one, but we gotta walk in it anyway, because the alternative is not neutrality, but it is the crooked path that just finds the straight one intolerable. And that is no path worth walking at all. So I hope you guys enjoyed this series, man. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Proverbs is just such a reliable foundation, and just full of practical applications, or full of verses that can be expanded and expounded on outwards to the point where we can reasonably make practical applications from them. So again, this was so good, man. And like, I just pray that you as a viewer were able to take something away from this.